Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by congressional reporter and top journalist Emily Brooks. Emily, we've seen Nancy Pelosi lose a little bit of control over her troops, and she really doesn't like that. Let's talk a little bit about how on the budget we've had some Democratic mishaps, perhaps.
Yes, so this was pretty rare in the House of Representatives. Usually everything that comes to the floor is predetermined and there's a plan. But similar to what happened with the Build Back Better bill last year, there was a lot of unexpected discontent within the Democratic caucus in the House when the omnibus spending package to fund the government came up. It was released in the wee hours of the night, and then it was supposed to pass the next day. And then Democrats were going to be off to their Democratic retreat, where they were going to talk about their policy priorities for the midterm elections. But instead what happened was there was an element of the bill that a lot of progressive Democrats were very upset about, because this was negotiated and this issue was missed, that there was coronavirus funding in there, but the new spending was offset by taking all of the old funds that had previously been appropriated in the last bill and saying that those are not available anymore. That was a problem because some states got funding through that bill all at once, and some had opted to split it up into two portions. And so by offsetting that, there were going to be a number of states that weren't getting the second portion. There was an hours-long delay trying to resolve this issue. Ultimately, the coronavirus portion was taken out of the omnibus, created into its own separate bill. That did pass the House, but it faces an uncertain future in the Senate because Republicans had negotiated that as part of the larger spending deal. Sure. It's unclear if of Republicans in the Senate, enough of them would support that in order to pass and become law.
So another Dems in disarray story that is featured prominently has been over the Russian oil ban, where normally the White House and the Democratic-controlled Congress sing from the same song sheet, but on this, at least initially, that wasn't the case.
Yes, the White House initially held back, and they were not in favor of banning energy imports from Russia, oil, natural gas, and coal, and there were a number of Democrats and Republicans who had come to kind of a bipartisan agreement in Congress saying, yes, we actually do want to do this. Bipartisan negotiators in the House and the Senate came up with a plan to do just that. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sort of upstaged and got ahead of President Biden by saying that, yes, let's ban it. And ultimately what ended up happening was President Biden essentially asked them to wait so he could announce his executive actions before they introduced this bill. And then when they did introduce the bill, it was different and a little bit weaker than the agreement that they had come to. So Republicans, while they did ultimately support this and it passed in the House, because it's been weakened so much, it is also unclear what will happen to the legislation in the Senate. Sure. And Republicans are a little bit annoyed by the negotiating there.
And there's kind of a situation where they're both supportive of cracking down on Russia, but also talking about the price increases, which are not limited to the Putin price hike, as the White House is calling it, but is a component in rising energy prices.
Yeah, certainly that is something that Republicans on Capitol Hill are hammering all the time. They're trying to advocate for actions that would unleash some more energy production in the United States. And Democrats largely are in favor of increasing oil production to an extent, but there is still that wider vision and that wider tension where Democrats do not want this to happen long term, where Republicans do.
So Congressman Van Taylor, not an amalgamation of Van Morrison and James Taylor, you did a great story looking at this sort of weird intersection of intellectual property rights and ISIS brides that brought down a congressman. What's the story there?
Well, this is a pretty scandalous story for anybody who saw the headlines. What happened was Van Taylor, who is married man and ran on his family values, is Texas congressman, first elected in 2018. He had an affair with a woman who was formerly married to a member of ISIS and lived with ISIS until she eventually escaped and went back to Texas and eventually met Van Taylor. So she had a bit of a tell-all.
Sure.
And so when that happened, right before that happened the day before and became public the day before the primary.
Right.
What's interesting about this case is that he was already in trouble before the primary. So in Texas,
He was in trouble before he got involved with an ISIS bride.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. In Texas, there's a system to where you have the primary. If there's multiple candidates, then the top two candidates will go to a runoff to determine who the nominee is. And there was a campaign against him for weeks, pretty high spending, about $500,000 on this campaign, calling him a rhino, slamming him for initially supporting the January 6th commission, which didn't end up ultimately happening before the select committee, and a number of other issues. And it was through a sort of a dark money operation or a PAC operation. It wasn't clear who exactly was funding this. It turns out after the election and after this unrelated ISIS bride story came out, it was a very specific issue that an inventor was interested in that caused him to pour a bunch of money into Van Taylor. He was a patent reform activist, a man who has created a patent and then had issues with it being copied and not being unable to defend it. And so he really wanted Van Taylor years ago to sign on to his legislation that he wants to get passed. Van Taylor refused, and in retaliation, he ran this campaign against him, which ultimately put him just under the 50% mark, forcing him into a runoff. That, combined with this ISIS bride story coming out, prompted him to say, well, rather than having more and more of this ISIS bride story come out into the open, he admitted to the fair in a statement, said that he regretted it, and ended his re-election campaign. And very interesting dynamics at play there, a number of combinations of things.
Well, they say politics makes strange bedfellows, right?
Yes.
Thank you for everything, Emily.
Thank you.
You can read Emily and the rest of our political team's coverage at WashingtonExaminer.com.